Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Greenbank's 25th Annual Investor Day. As the chair of Rathbones, I am immensely proud of this being our 25th Greenbank Investor Day, a quarter of a century of doing the right thing. It signals our company's long history at the vanguard of ethical, sustainable, and impact investment. And as you would expect, this is reflected in the wealth of experience our Greenbank team has in helping our clients find investments that align with their values. Once again, the team has curated an excellent lineup of speakers to help us navigate today's subject, which is food for thought, how to build a healthier food system with a particular emphasis on the UK and on action. Self-evidently, this topic is really relevant and matters. Food and drink manufacturing contributes more to the United Kingdom's economy than all other manufacturing sectors combined. It represents about 5% of our GDP, or about £112 billion annually, employs 470,000 individuals directly, and in total about 4.2 million workers are in the farm to fork food chain economy. Alongside these impressive macroeconomic numbers, the UK has another challenge. Today, the UK government spends 18 billion pounds on obesity-linked conditions, reflecting almost 8% of the NHS's total budget. Imagine the alternative between everyone in the United Kingdom eating properly versus 67 million people eating badly. As I said a moment ago, getting this right matters for all of us. And today is not just about the thinking, but it's also about the doing. Responsible investment at Rathbones is about doing. And as you would expect, after 25 years, we offer a wide spectrum of services designed to meet different client needs. More broadly, we are proud of the way in which Greenbank's business provides a halo effect to the rest of the group. At their instigation, we challenge ourselves to be bolder and faster in terms of how the firm can adapt to. We are very proud of the way in which Greenbank's business provides a halo effect to the rest of our group. And at their instigation, we challenge ourselves to be bolder and faster in terms of how the firm can adapt to this rapidly changing investment environment. A good example of Greenbank's energetic engagement with policymakers is evidenced in their calling for consistent company reporting on health and nutrition. Greenbank has galvanized support for this initiative from an investor coalition representing over £6 trillion in assets under management. You'll hear more about this from Sophie during today's event. I know that you will find today's content both informative and thought-provoking. There will be plenty of scope for questions to our panel after the presentations that will start shortly. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to John David, Head of Greenbank, who will guide us through today's agenda. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Clive, and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Greenbank team to all of you joining us today. We're delighted to see so many joining our 25th Investor Day, perhaps one advantage of an online event, the technical issues, perhaps the disadvantage. As Clive said, we are very proud to have reached this 25th year milestone. The UK is a hub for innovation in ethical, sustainable, and impact investment. And we have been at the forefront of this over the last 20 years or so. But we are not complacent about our position or the investment proposition that we have refined and developed over many years. In fact, over the past couple of years, we have been going through a significant phase of evolution and growth at Greenbank, which is enabling us to serve a growing number of clients to the highest of standards, whilst helping to magnify the positive impact we can have on wider society and the environment, both through the investment decisions we make and our engagement activity, more of which later. Our Sustainable Development Theme Framework sits at the heart of how we invest at Greenbank and considers 8 key areas where investments can contribute to a sustainable planet and more equitable society. One of these themes is health and well-being, and Sophie will talk more later about how we build this issue into our investment process and also the stewardship work that we conduct. So why are we here today? Well, as Clive has already said, we simply cannot afford to fail at building a healthy food system because the costs of inaction, both to business and to the wider economy, as well as to broader society and the environment, are too great. Today's event will explore the latest research on health and nutrition, what companies are doing to improve the health of our population, and critically, what investors can do to be part of the change that we all need to see. I don't want to preempt too much of what we are going to hear from our speakers, but some of the statistics I have read on the subject of food and food supply are really quite shocking. The Food Foundation, for example, reports that 8.8% of households, so that's 4.7 million adults, have experienced food insecurity in the past month in the UK. But at the same time, 1 in 5 children is overweight or obese by the time they start school. And 2 in 3 adults in the UK are overweight or obese. Clive has talked about the costs of this issue. And it's not confined to the UK or even developed world countries. Similar patterns are now emerging in developing nations. This is a very topical subject. We see all around us soaring food prices, as well as the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the global food supply chain. And this week, we saw the publication of the government's sadly lackluster white paper response to Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy Plan, again, about which we will hear more a little later. So there's certainly a lot to unravel and discuss at today's event, but before I introduce our chair, I would just like to run through some quick IT and housekeeping, as well as an overview of today's agenda. First of all, you can submit a question at any time through the engagement panel with the scrolling bar on the right of your screen. We will answer as many questions as time permits during the Q&A, and do feel free to post your question anonymously if you would prefer. Throughout the presentations, the speakers may instigate a poll, and this will also pop up on the engagement panel. Do please answer the questions as they arise. We also have Greenbank publications to download from the engagement panel, as well as the National Food Strategy Independent Review. Throughout the morning, if you are on Twitter, we are Rathbone Greenbank Investments at Greenbank Invest. So do please tweet about the event using the hashtags #Health and Nutrition, and that's using an ampersand, #Food Systems, and #InvestorDay22 in numbers. If you do lose connection, then please try and rejoin through the event link. And if you're having any issues using the conference portal, then click the head mic in the top right-hand corner, also available under the engagement panel under stream assistance. And if our speakers do have any internet issues, do please bear with us. If a speaker becomes unworkable, Sophie or the next speaker will jump in to pick up and guide us forward, so hang on in there. Onto the agenda then. You can see the agenda on the slide in front of you. We have 3 speaker presentations and an interview with a short break halfway through, and our event will conclude with a panel discussion. I'm now delighted to welcome Baroness Rosie Boycott, our chair today. Rosie is a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, and her knowledge and experience of health and nutrition have been built over many years and from many roles within the sector, including 10 years as the chair of the London Food Board, responsible to the Mayor of London for food policy. Rosie is also an activist in food poverty, health, environment, and agricultural sustainability, as well as a trustee of the Food Foundation. I'm delighted that Rosie has kindly joined us to guide us through the event today, and I'll now hand over to you, Rosie. Many thanks.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you so much. It's terrific to be here. I first want to apologise for the fact that I think you've only got a photo of me because I'm definitely having some technical challenges. But aside from that, I couldn't be happier to be there, and I couldn't be happier that we're doing this week, because you've lined up some fantastic speakers, including an interview and an update with Henry Dimbleby, because food is right at the top of this week's agenda. It could not be more important, and I thought both Clive and John really set out the facts, the downsides, and the importance both economically, from the point of view of health, and from everything. Food really is the hot topic of today. So I'm Professor Corinna Hawkes, who's Director of the Centre for Food Policy at City University of London. Corinna took over from Professor Tim Lang, which makes her only the second professor of food policy that we've had in this country. Her knowledge is awesome, and I think that she will set the scene for what we go on to talk about. So, Corinna, with no further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Rosie, and great to be here. Can I just check you can hear me okay? Well, the talk I'm going to give is very aspirational. It's about imagining a world where everybody would eat in a way that supports their health and well-being. That's where we need to get to if we're going to be a healthy world supported by a food system that is effective and supports health as well as sustainability, livelihoods, and economy. So why aren't we eating healthy diets for all? Why aren't we all eating healthy diets? The vast majority of people in this country, and indeed around the world, want to be healthy. And they want their children to be healthy. But let me start by telling you a story. This is Justin. Let's start with him at home in the evening. He's a small boy. He lives in London in a very small flat, which is very difficult to access. And in the evening, his mother does the best she possibly can to try and prepare a decent meal. It's rather difficult for her to do that when all she has is a microwave and nowhere to sit and eat food. It's not a situation that helps her feed her child well, however much she loves and cares for him. Because of the noise around the flat, Justin doesn't sleep very well. There's not very much for him to do. They're very short of money. So he doesn't sleep well. He wakes up feeling irritated. And anybody, by the way, who's had a toddler or a baby, know that in the most advantaged of circumstances, this can be very challenging. Getting to nursery is difficult because of the location of the flat relative to the nursery. And the high street is full of temptation. When Justin hasn't eaten much at home, the idea of spending 20 pence on a cheap B-brand snack is just the easiest thing to do to try and soothe his nerves. And when he gets to nursery, even though there's healthy food there, because he's not developed the taste preferences, he doesn't really like it. And so it goes, a vicious cycle for a boy living in conditions not of his own making. Now, this is one story, and there are many different stories. But the reality is that for anybody experiencing disadvantage, eating well is hard. To be honest, it's hard for all of us, the temptation that there is around us, but it is particularly hard for those experiencing inequalities. And in the fantastic evidence review that was conducted in support of the independent review for a national food strategy by Henry Dimbleby's team, there is some data that really depicts the reality of what people are eating as a result of these challenges that everybody faces. And these slides come from that evidence pack. We mostly fail to meet dietary recommendations on fruits and vegetables, on meats, on saturated fat, and on sugar. Over half of our diets are ultra-processed foods, and higher ultra-processed foods consumption is associated with weight gain. The UK has one of the highest rates of obesity in Europe, and as you can see, it's been growing steadily over time. And it's not just about obesity, but it's about poor diet, which then in turn influences the disease risk in the population and the burden of diet-related disease. And as I noted earlier, dietary disparities are very much in existence, with people who experience disadvantage, which of course has become very much greater in the current food price crisis and the cost of living crisis, that people who experience disadvantage does mean that those people, those children, eat worse diets for their health. And the same is true for adults too. And you can see here by obesity prevalence that people who experience more disadvantage, this is for children, are more likely to be affected by obesity. So there are large disparities. So when we are talking about health for all, healthy diets for all, about improving diets, we have to think about it from the lens of inequalities in the UK population. And of course, that is very present now, given the household food insecurity. And we know that as income decreases, households are more likely to be food insecure, which is then compounded by price rises, as we've all been hearing about in the media. But the link between food insecurity and health is there. People who are more food insecure tend to consume poor quality diets. So in that gloom and doom, and with that story of Justin as just one story of many, what will it take to make the difference? What do we need to do? Not just to tinker around the edges, but to fundamentally change towards a vision where the people of this country and the people in other countries as well, it could be the case all around the world, what will it actually take to achieve healthy diets for all? In the work that we do at the Centre for Food Policy in collaboration with others, we try and take a people-centred approach. And in that work, we have found what it's going to take to make the difference. We can't prove it, of course, because nobody has done this. There is nowhere in the world that has helped its population, supported its population to eat, support health, to enable people to eat maximally for their health and well-being. So that note in the middle really should say, the title of this really should be, what would it take to achieve healthy diets for all? And that bit in the middle would say, if people had easy availability and access to health promoting foods rather than non-healthy foods, if they had support for the emotional and mental capacity that it takes, just as Justin's mother did not have the support that she needed to overcome all of those barriers and stresses to provide well for her child, even though that's what she wanted to do. To make sure that prompts and prices in food environments are pulling us towards the healthy option and away from the unhealthy one. To ensure that people are financially secure to afford the health promoting food, so that they have time to prepare it, so they have the household assets. They don't just have a microwave stuck in the corner, and they have a table to sit on, and they have the infrastructure to access having healthy foods. That they have the information that they need and the food literacy to try and navigate the environments around them. That they have the skills that they need, that they have the social networks, the norms, the social institutions there to support them. Sorry, the next one is an error. It repeats another one, and it should say that there is an environment around people that generates trust in healthy food. Trust is so important. And by doing so also generates a desire to eat that food, to generate healthy preferences among children. And that, as a result of all of this, people have a sense of identity, of meaning, of value around eating healthily. If all of these things were in place, we would eat healthy diets. That's a big agenda, But it's also an exciting one, because it means there's lots to do. And there's lots of things that so many different actors in the system, so many different stakeholders can do to make a difference. So whether you're an investor, whether you're in government, whether you're in local government, whether you're a business, whether you're an individual, whether you're a community group or an NGO, there's something that you can do to help support people to live the life and eat the diet that we all deserve. But that's going to take systemic change. If you think about all of these changes that need to happen, there are many policies and practices in place already that are doing these things. There's restrictions on advertising to children in place in the UK. There's a healthy voucher scheme, the Healthy Start scheme, which aims to encourage and enable affordability. There are school food standards. There are education programs in schools. Certain of these things are there. They're not comprehensive enough, and it doesn't add up by all the different actors involved. So for real collective impact, we need to take concerted effort to do these in a comprehensive way, to make sure that everybody is taking their role to intervene in the system that they have power to intervene in. Because this isn't about going to individuals and saying, here's some support for your emotional capacity. Here is a bit of information. Here's some skills. Here's a bit of training to try and have you a value food. This is not about targeting individuals. It's about targeting the system which influences these lived realities. So it's about making change in the education system, the food system, the economic system, in the system of built infrastructure, in the socio-cultural system, in all of these systems. So there's many things that we can do. The question is, what will you do? And if we all took our role and played our responsibility, we would help address this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Corinna. That was really inspiring and a fantastic way to set up this afternoon's discussion. And absolutely all the way through it, you can see what you're working towards, which is that we need system change, and that actually we have already in place so many of the things and activities that we just need to push harder on, make them more available, and as you said, get and create an environment in which people can trust the healthiness and the need for healthy food. So that is fantastic. It's a very tall order, as you said. There's lots to do, but clearly a lot of what you're saying has been incorporated in the food strategy, that the white paper that came out on Monday, and we're going to hear more reactions to that as we go along. And I've got no doubt that there's going to be quite a lot of questions about, how people think this has been, how they think the white paper has gone. But now I'd like to, we'll be back with you but now I'd like to come on to Judith Batchelar, who is the Director of Food Matters International. I personally have known Judith for a long time when she was the head of brand at Sainsbury's, and she brings an enormous amount of experience and wisdom and just a huge overview, a panoramic overview of how food really works. And I mean that in a very genuine way. Other people come at it from what they might like to see. Judith knows what's there. So Judith, big welcome to you.
Thank you, Rosie. And like Corinna, I am really, really pleased to be here today for what is a hugely important debate, and probably one of the biggest debates of my working life. And having spent 40 years working on some of these things, and 25 years getting to the point where we could have multiple traffic light labelling on foods, I know that as well as the size of the task that Corinna's just described, we need to move at a pace that we've never moved at before. So I've got lots of things to say in 10 minutes, so I'm going to canter through my slides quickly, but suffice to say that everything that you've just heard, I agree with. But what I would like to focus on is the system that sits behind this. And I won't go through this in any great detail, but the reason for showing this slide is the way that our food is produced and the way that it arrives on customers, consumers' plates is broken. And whether you look through that through the lens of plastic, whether it's through the lens of agriculture, fresh water extractions, the health of our oceans, food waste, and malnutrition, it's just not working. And it certainly isn't going to deliver what we need to feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. And as you've heard, in order to shift that massive system that is broken, we need an enabling environment that enables the system in its entirety to shift. And again, those are some of the things that you've heard about already. I suppose the key thing for me, as someone who's worked in various bits of the food system, from agriculture, manufacturing, all the way through to retailing, the question is why we all know this, but why nothing happens. And I described this as the kind of gap between knowing and doing. And if you look at the why we know what we know, but why we haven't managed to do anything about it for so long, there are certain key things that I think are barriers to that, and all sorts of different motivations, but I won't be able to cover them all in 10 minutes. So I've picked out a few that I think really would unleash or fill the gap and unleash the potential to actually do something material about these things with the scale of ambition that Corinna has just described. And what do I mean by the gap between knowing and doing? You can think of this about as the difference between the what and the how. And the knowing what to do, the what, is something that quite often we think we've agreed and aligned on, but in reality, we haven't, because we haven't understood each other, we haven't understood the system and the demands on the system. We haven't really established full understanding. And if there was one thing that the National Food Strategy would have done, the detail and the articulation of that strategy really was getting under the skin of these things to the point where we would have established understanding, we would have provided the right kind of information and evidence, and we would have gained commitment around that. And all of that can be done in a pre-competitive space. So you'll often hear people talk about the fact that, you know, there's competition, there's commercial sensitivities. All of those things around the what can happen perfectly easily in a well convened pre-competitive space. And if you get alignment around the what, then building the tools to deliver the how becomes a lot easier. And whether that's systems and processes, whether that is management information, metrics and reporting, whether that's setting KPIs, targets and incentives for business, and whether that is getting good stakeholder feedback that assesses how the system is really performing. All of those things are much, much easier if everyone truly understands what they've signed up to. And how many times do you see people make commitments when they don't really understand what they've committed to or how they're going to achieve it? But as I say, this has to be a systems-based approach, and therefore the role of different stakeholders within the system needs to be understood, and it needs to be planned for if we are to drive the kind of systemic change at the pace that we need to drive it at. And again, you've heard about, you know, what customers eat being at the heart of this, and what they eat being driven by very many different things. And we have got to address all of those things in a systematic way. And one of the things that is a challenge around this, particularly when we're talking about healthy and sustainable, so what's good for human health and what's good for planetary health. And I understand that's still quite a simple statement to make, but it's a very complicated one. So quite often, people don't understand that the way food is produced is more important than necessarily where it's produced. So if you look at where greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, the big bulk of it is at what we used to call the pre-farm gate, but it's at the agricultural end of things. And therefore, getting farmers and growers wherever they are in the world, because a lot of our food that we consume is imported, moving to more sustainable and healthy food production systems is really important. And there's lots of evidence to say that as soil health has declined, so has the nutrient quality of crops, so has the nutrient profile of livestock that's produced in intensive ways. So there is lots of evidence that basically how our food produced is not just a greenhouse gas emission challenge, but it's also a nutrition and health challenge. And I say, I share that there because that's one of very, very many areas of food choices that aren't understood. And that's not going to be material for all customers, but it is when people are driving choices in the marketplace that can't be. The second area that is a challenge is the fact that what the world produces is not what the world should be eating. So even if we could wave a magic wand tomorrow and everybody understood the benefits of eating a healthy and sustainable diet, we wouldn't be able to do that. And that's taking into account lots of different cultural and ethical considerations around food choices. And one of the biggest challenges in this is that we've got a global food system that is both highly fragmented, so lots of smallholder farmers, millions of customers, but in lots of places highly consolidated. And whether that's manufacturers, processors, or in certain instances, retailers. And the combination of a highly fragmented and a highly consolidated food system makes driving these kinds of changes around producing the food that we should be eating, as opposed to the food that we are producing, really difficult. So that's a challenge for us. There is also a bit of a challenge on what the to-be world looks like. And I put this one up because it's been a bit of a live topic around something that was published in The Lancet around the global burden of disease and eating particularly red meat. And I'm not showing this to make a judgment on it at all, but I'm sharing it because it's an example of where even the experts don't agree. And again, not having accepted common wisdom or that the market can work with is always going to be a challenge for consumers. And we've seen that on nutrition and healthy diets advice for years. It's now spread into, what constitutes a healthy and sustainable diet. And, 2 slides forward. But that aside, the biggest thing from my perspective in terms of the doing of all of this is building the data and information and establishing the tools to be able to do the job. And whether that's new ways of working, I talked about the pre-competitive space and aligning the market around very clear and determined outcomes, whether that is eating more fruit and veg, whether that's eating less red meat and dairy, whether that's getting more fiber into people's diets. How are we going to create those systems and processes that deliver those things? And how are we going to measure those things in a way that is accurate, transparent, and creates a level playing field? And data standards and reporting is quite an interesting one. And from the point of view of this, what I'll use as an example is nutrition labelling. So you go and buy a packet of food, it's got green, amber, red traffic light labelling on it, it's got a nutrition panel on the back. That nutrition panel will have lots of things on it, but if we take fibre as an example, fibre will have a definition. Now, there are many definitions of fibre, but for the purposes of putting it on a piece of packaging, there's only one. And for that definition of fibre, there will be multiple ways of testing that food and analysing that food to basically determine the fibre content. But under the rules, there is only one analytical method that's used. And the laboratories that do that testing will be certified and accredited. And that's the kind of thing that we need for everything to do with the food system: definitions, standards, and verification tools. And therefore, whenever you see information presented to you, or as an investor, you are assessing a company's performance on these things, you can be very confident of what you're looking at. And if that, you take as an example of that, something like the percentage of sales from healthier products in a company's portfolio, there are hundreds of definitions of what constitutes healthy sales. And that could be something as simple as non-HFSS, high fat, sugar and salt foods, or it could be something that's more complicated and based around multiple traffic light labelling, for example. But there are no standards, and that's a problem for us. The other thing is that if you want systemic change, you need a systemic business case. And that business case needs to look at all stakeholders in the system. It needs to look at impact, the full business value to all of those stakeholders. And it needs to understand how to manage the synergies, but also the trade-offs, on the basis that there is no way that all of the things we need to take into consideration can all individually be optimized. So how do we create those connected business cases that show the value? Because we all know, as you heard at the beginning, the cost to the NHS of poor diets, the cost to individuals of a poor diet. Yet when we talk about these things in the round, we don't create these connected business cases. If we were to create those connected business cases, most of them would be very clear about where investment needed to be made and where we could see the return on that investment from a societal point of view. The next challenge is basically one of global to local. So we live in this great big global food system, but we have local needs. And for me, this is how do we use this great data and our insights to create tailored solutions at a local, regional, community level to the very specific challenges of that community. But at the same time, measuring our progress and impact on those things with harmonized standards. So there's some good news on that. There are things that are happening at a global level around, in this instance, I'm using climate change as an example, but it could be anything, that says we understand we need to create global standards, and we know that every business that reports on these things in their annual report needs to be reporting on them consistently. So I think we've got the message there, but it clearly isn't happening widely yet. And the other part about that reporting is it needs to include both the foods that we produce in our own country assessed with the foods that we import from other countries. And this is something that the NFU will have talked about a lot in terms of levelling up on standards of food production, whether that's crops, dairy or livestock, because whilst we might talk about our impressive record in reducing UK greenhouse gas emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions from the foods that we consume hasn't really changed much at all. And then how do investors look at some of these things? So recently launched ahead of COP26 was the World Benchmarking Alliance Food and Agriculture Benchmark. which is a composite of a number of other food and agriculture benchmarks, including the Access to Nutrition Index from Share Action. And the more that we can all use the same indices and ensure that those benchmarks are founded on great data with great standards, the more we'll be able to make the comparisons between those businesses that are doing the right things for the food system and doing the right things and the way our food is produced around the world, and what we're doing to ensure customers, citizens have a healthier diet. So knowing to doing requires lots of things to happen, but establishing true understanding and alignment, building those new systems and processes and ways of working. Corinna said, you know, we need something that is more concerted, and definitely it's beyond collaboration. It's about cohesive action and well choreographed action that does things in the right order at the right time. You can't do that without data. You can't do that without ambitious and transparent targets. Mandatory reporting is probably going to be the only way to go, because I don't think people will do this voluntarily, certainly not in a standardized and harmonized way. We need some open feedback loops that tell us how we're going, and I say we need to move at pace and scale. So that is it from me. Thank you for listening, and back to you, Rosie.
Judith, thank you so much. What a strong sense about how where it is produced, which I think is fantastically important. And also that, you know, we do live in a global food system, as well as, of course, in a global world where climate change is concerned. So all these things need to be connected. And you did throw out an awful lot of challenges there, both to business, both to the government, both to the consumer, in terms of what we need to be doing. So I'm really thrilled to move on now to our next segment of today's seminar, which is an interview with Sophie Lawrence, who's the Senior Ethical, Sustainable and Impact Researcher at Rathbone Greenbank Investments, with Henry Dimbleby, who is a man who has certainly been in the news this week. Henry was the lead author at DEFRA of the government's National Food Strategy, the first food strategy that the country has ever had since the war, Second World War, since we've had a few others. So it's monumentally important, and I think it was a brilliant piece of work. This interview was strategy white paper from the government, came out on Monday. So what Sophie did was catch up with Henry in his really busy schedule yesterday. So we're going to play you Henry's recording from last week, and then you're going to hear his response to what the government has said and came out with on Monday. And then after that, I'll come back to you, and that will be just before our break. Anyway, over to Sophie to start the Henry video.
Hello, everyone. I am Sophie Lawrence, and I lead our stewardship and engagement work here at Greenbank. And I am really excited to be joined virtually today by Henry Dimbleby. I'm sure for many of you, Henry needs no introduction. Among the many hats he wears, Henry recently led the National Food Strategy, which was the first independent review of England's food system in 75 years. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you.
So to start us off, could you please give us your elevator pitch for what the National Food Strategy is and what some of the key recommendations were that you proposed to the UK government?
Yes, so I was asked to do the food strategy in 2019, before COVID, before Ukraine, before the cost of living crisis that we currently face. And my brief was to set out how we could create a food system that not only provided plentiful food to people at a reasonable price, but also did so in a way that stopped making us sick and destroying the planet. And the need for that has actually become even greater now. Those tensions are becoming ever more serious as a result of that series of crises that we've been through over the last 2 years. when we looked and tried to diagnose the system and understand how you could change it, what we recognized was that the food system's been through an extraordinary change since the Second World War. We thought we were going to run out of food. There wouldn't be enough land to farm to feed the huge increase in population from 2.5 to almost 8 billion people today, and that people would starve. And the solution to that was the Green Revolution. Nitrogen fertilizers mixed with new breeds of plants and modern irrigation techniques. It radically changed how much food you could grow from any given piece of land. We now have 1.7 times the number of calories per person on this planet than we did in 1945. And that is with almost 4 times the number of people and off the same amount of land. It's one of the great success stories of human ingenuity. And yet it created problems that we now realize are as serious as the problems we faced in 1945. So it is by far, the food system is the biggest cause of environmental destruction, biodiversity destruction, freshwater pollution and shortage, deforestation, clearing out of the oceans, and alongside energy is the biggest, one of the 2 biggest causes of climate change. And it is also the biggest cause of preventable disease and will cause the health service to collapse if we don't do something about it. By 2035, it's estimated that we are going to be spending more on treating type 2 diabetes alone than we do on treating all cancers today. The health service is going to collapse. And so what do we do about it? Well, what we identified were 2 feedback loops that needed to be fixed in the system. One we call the junk food cycle, and this is fundamentally an interaction between our evolved appetite, which loves sugary, fatty, salty food, and if it's low in fiber, we eat more of it without getting full, and the commercial incentives of companies. And companies have realized that we like this stuff. They've spent more and more marketing and doing research on products that feed that environmental love. We eat more, they spend more, we eat more, we get sick. And that feedback loop needs to be broken, and it needs to be broken by government, because one company can't do it alone. The second problem is what we call the invisibility of nature, and the fact that in the systems that we use to measure human success, nature is invisible. We actually fund the destruction of nature, governments worldwide, to the tune of about $500 billion. You don't see nature in your wallet, it's not on the balance sheet of companies, it's not on the way that we measure GDP. And as a result, our economies have been extracting huge amounts of value and destroying nature. So how do you fix those 2 things? Well, we recommended that there were 4 areas where we needed policy interventions. The first was breaking the junk food cycle, direct commercial interventions in to make it harder for companies to make money from the stuff that kills us. And also something you've been campaigning for, mandatory reporting, so that we can see what it is that companies are selling, how that's changing over time. We can see if we are doing better over time. The second area was supporting the diets of the less affluent people, people who are struggling with poverty. Poverty is not a problem that can be solved by the food system, but it is something that there are policies that you can do that help take the edge off some of the pain. The third area was making the best use of our land, bringing nature back into our measurement systems, and then using our land not just to produce food, but also to restore biodiversity and sequester carbon. And then finally, we need a change in our food culture. We're not going to solve this problem for the long term until we solve the problem of the kind of food cultures and diets that have become prevalent over the last 30, 40 years.
Really interesting. Thanks for that brilliant summary of a really big plan and really ambitious project that you worked on. And really next, I'm really curious to get your thoughts on what you think about the UK government's response so far. So you submitted the plan in July last year. You know, what have they done in response?
Well, they're kind of 4 bites of the cherry. They did actually quite a lot during COVID with a bit of help from Marcus Rashford. They put in place quite a lot of my recommendations to support the diets of those who are really struggling. In the Levelling Up white paper in January, they put in a big range of measures on education and on community eat well, on trying to make communities healthier. And we're now waiting for the government's food strategy white paper, which we think is imminent, which I think will largely deal with the environmental side of things and the food security side of things. And then finally, the Department for Health and Social Care is planning to publish something on health disparities, so this problem of health inequality, and that, I hope, will contain stuff on food. So quite a bit already done, but the big stuff yet to come.
Great. And the last thought from you, if I may, what would you like to see investors do to be agents for change on this topic?
Well, I think for their benefit, first of all, long-term investors need to work out what they are going to have to divest from and when, because by nature, unsustainable things are unsustainable. So companies that are currently making money in environmental or health destructive things will in the end stop making money there. So that's a consideration for investors. I think in the environment now, there's huge potential for green finance and investment. But as shareholders of companies, I think that they can do two things. One is on the environment side, there are lots of things that companies can do without harming products to be environmentally more sustainable, and shareholders should be putting pressure on there. On the health side, it's more nuanced. I actually don't think there's much that companies can do alone on the health side, but they can disclose what they're doing. And I think the single thing that that investors could do on the health side is to put pressure on companies to report the kinds of food they're selling, you know, the amount of meat, the amount of foods high in fat, salt, and sugar, and that will shine a light in detail on what's going on in the company in the country, and will then kind of put more compulsion on the government to act and enable the government to act in a sensible way.
Great, and you'll hear a bit more about what we're doing on this, so thank you for that segue into the final session of today. But for now, thank you so much for your time, Henry. It's been great to have this conversation with you. Thanks.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Henry, thank you so much for coming back to chat with us. We were really keen to get you back, as since we spoke last week, the government's response to your recommendations have obviously come out. And I'm sure some of our audience will have read some of your reaction in the press over the last couple of days. But overall, to what extent do you feel that the government's response addresses the recommendations that you laid out in your plan last summer?
So what I'd say first is don't believe everything you read in the press. One of the things I was reported as saying is that it wasn't a strategy. And what I meant by that was it isn't the whole car that we need to create to drive to the promised world. It is a part of that car. And actually what they announced, the most important thing that they announced on Monday was that they would be producing a land use framework. And I think that's really interesting. They'll be the first government, as far as I'm aware, worldwide to be doing that, setting out how you're going to use the scarce resource that is land to sequester carbon, restore biodiversity, produce food, produce energy, and which bits of land are better at doing that. That will be, before you've done that, you cannot create the future of regulation and farming regulation and payments, because you need to know what you want to happen to that land. That will be an enormously political piece of work. There'll be all sorts of vested interests. Everyone will think it's going to play in their direction, but it's a critical piece of work. The other thing that was in there, which is important, was another of my recommendations, which was on creating a data program. So really getting serious about trying to define the metrics, you know, what do we mean by all of these environmental metrics, and then mandating companies to publish data on them so that we can begin to understand actually how the system works better. The two things that were missing for me on the environment side were there's still nothing on trade. There's still no explanation about how they're going to protect our farmers from cheap imports from other countries, which at the same time would export environmental harms. Basically, you do the harm somewhere far away rather than here. And it didn't give it, which I think it needs to, a statutory basis. There's no bill to keep momentum between parliaments. On health, they basically kicked the can down the road. So they said, which was great, there's a problem. We recognize the junk food cycle. That's in itself is kind of quite fundamental. We recognize that you will need regulation to break this commercial incentive of companies. But they said over to the health secretary, who will set out how we're going to do that in the health disparities white paper. So overall, a couple of really important things, progress, but we need more. It needs to be bolder, and all eyes now on the health disparities white paper.
Brilliant. Thank you for that assessment. It's really great to hear directly from you, obviously as the author of the food strategy. And I'm glad you picked out the data piece. I'll be talking about that a bit more in my presentation later. But for now, thank you so much, Henry, for coming back to speak with us. And let's see what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Henry, in absentia, and that was terrific, Sophie, that you managed to catch up with him yesterday, and at least to hear that really positive message that some of what's in the food strategy is really going to be important and productive and start to make the kind of changes that we've been hearing about from both Judith and Corinna. Now, before we come to our break and a short film, I think you'll probably see on your screens that we're going to do a quick poll. Overall, would you be supportive of the UK government introducing a sugar and salt tax to help improve the nation's diets? This is a seriously important question, and it's really useful to get what you think into our knowledge. So now I'm going to pass you over to a video that has been made about FareShare Southwest. Now, this is a wonderful charity that has been massively supported by Rathbones. You will find out all about it, and I'm not going to waste the time telling you, just to say that I've done lots of work with FareShare over many years, and I have seen how truly effective they are in ways that, quite frankly, are hugely important to FareShare in the Southwest. And so enjoy the video, and then we'll have a brief break, but it's going to be brief, like a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back up for Sophie's talk. So over to the movie.
During the pandemic, FareShare Southwest grew our operations fast. We were asked by our community to deliver major emergency food funded by DEFRA. We delivered our food stock winter operations, packed thousands of food parcels, set up distribution hubs to get the vital food supply into Devon and Cornwall, where there was no previous FareShare food supply. We formed new partnerships with incredible Southwest charities. Our pandemic work was delivered using temporary warehouses, temporary vans and short-term funding.
In the last 2 years, almost an unrecognisable charity to what we were before, and everything's got a lot more complex. The amount of surplus food we need to source, the volunteers, the operations, the logistics. It's a much more complex charity than before the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we just operated in this warehouse here in central Bristol. We now have 3 active warehouses in Bristol, a sub-depot in Exeter, and we've just launched a warehouse in Plymouth. Pre-pandemic, we were delivering enough food for just over 1 million meals. We're now delivering 5 times that volume, so enough food to support 5.5 million meals each year.
FareShare Southwest has merged from the pandemic, a different charity, able to serve our region on a different scale. In September 2021, we launched our new South Bristol warehouse in Bedminster, allowing us to redistribute 20% more food. This warehouse will also be the site for the new employability centre, helping get young people into work and training. In October 2021, working with a partner charity, Exeter Food Action, we launched food deliveries to Exeter. And in January 2020, we opened the shutters at our Plymouth warehouse, allowing us to deliver regular weekly food deliveries into Devon and Cornwall charities for the first time ever. So the new footprint has allowed FareShare Southwest to support more charities, particularly those charities based in rural, isolated areas that have never experienced this level of support before.
So it's given us a lifeline, really, and we always talk about being a lifeline to people needing food, and actually, you know, FareShare are kind of a lifeline to us, which means that we can give good quality provision to the people that need our food parcels. If a family can plan for their meals and they know they've got food on the table for 3, 4, 5 days, it takes a lot of pressure off them. It alleviates the worry and the fuss that they go through.
For those of us who are providing food, Fair Share is one of the best things that's happened in Plymouth for a long while. It provides us with a greater variety of food, lots of wholesome, fresh, nutritious food. It's really increased the variety and range of food that we can provide.
Growing this fast is not easy. When we commit to delivering to a new charity, we are committing to supporting them forever. We can't just simply stop. That means that we must have all of the pieces of the puzzle lined up, and that includes our warehouse space, food suppliers, enough volunteers, and enough fans and staff. But luckily we do have a team of people committed to this work who care deeply about their community and stopping food waste. What can you do to help Fair Share South West? Donate, help keep our wheels turning. Volunteer and get the word out. Connect us to South West food companies.
And welcome back from the break of ideas about what's going on in the good work that Rathbone's done and the work that Fair Share does. It's really vital, especially with the cost of living squeeze. So we've got the poll results in, and I can tell you that it's one of the most emphatic polls I think I've ever come across. I'm not going to say it's 100%, but it's not far off it. 90.9% of you said that they would be happy for the government to tax sugar and salt to help improve the nation's health, which means that only 9.1% voted against it. I think that's really significant, and thank you all. As someone who's worked for this kind of result, thank you all very much. And it gives one a lot of encouragement to know that you all are on side with this, almost all of you. Now I would like to welcome as our last speaker before we come to the Q&A, Sophie Lawrence, whose new role is the Stewardship and Engagement Lead at Rathbone Greenbank Investments. I'm sorry if I got that wrong when introducing Sophie before. And Sophie's going to set out investment case and what Greenbanks owe. We're going to come to questions with Sophie's presentation to the box at the moment, and we'll do our best to come to as many as we can. So Sophie, over to you.
So just thank you so much, Rosie, for that introduction. And I am going to share the investor perspective today. First, looking at why this is an important issue for investors, and then focusing on how we've been using stewardship and engagement as a tool to catalyse positive change on this really important issue. So starting with the compelling and growing business case then for investors to be looking at health and nutrition. At Greenbank, we think about these reasons as sitting into two core buckets, if we can go to the next slide. So firstly, the financially material risks and opportunities that as responsible investors, we need to manage effectively on behalf of our clients. Secondly, the moral imperative to act on issues that have widespread social or environmental impacts that we can help to mitigate and manage. So within the risk and opportunity bucket, the mounting economic costs of diet-related diseases generate direct and indirect risks for company bottom lines. And if we can just go to the next slide, if that's okay. So first, we expect regulatory action from governments, both in the UK and globally, to continue to rise. Although we've recently seen planned regulation to restrict the promotion of products high in sugar, salt and fat delayed, and the salt and sugar tax dismissed in the government's response to the food strategy, and if they had seen your poll, then they might have changed their mind on that, we do still anticipate more regulation to hit in the coming years in the face of financially unsustainable health trends and mounting multi-stakeholder pressure on the government to act. There is also a reputational risk for companies from where customers and other stakeholders deem their approach to be insufficient. Companies can mitigate these risks if they take a forward-looking and proactive approach to health and nutrition, rather being forced to act through regulation. Importantly, we also need to consider the systemic risks, the negative long-term impacts on the workforce and on economic growth from poor health attributed to diet, which can have a negative impact for companies across multiple sectors. These risks need to be dealt with at the national or regional level, as no one company can insulate itself from these far-reaching impacts. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the risks. Sorry, can we just go back to the previous slide? I was a bit early to do that. We also have the opportunities. So these come with the higher demand for affordable, healthy options and changing dietary preferences. And there's also the system-wide opportunity to improve health and add to global GDP and the productivity of the workforce. Good health at the end of the day is an asset both to the wider economy and the investors in it. So we have the risks, opportunities, but let's not forget the moral and social imperative to act, which we've heard about a lot today. There is a significant impact on individual health and well-being from unhealthy diets, and there's also the impact on our health systems. So thinking briefly about how this fits with our research process. So we have our 8 sustainable development themes, which will now be very familiar to you if you are a Greenbank client. And these guide how we invest, and the themes represent the key areas where we feel companies and the private sector can help to drive sustainability outcomes. And those include environmental themes, such as habitats and ecosystems, and energy and climate, as well as social themes, such as health and wellbeing, that link to today's discussion. We think about how these themes are going to play out in the long term, and what are some of the political, technological, and social drivers that will be influencing how these themes evolve. And then at the company level, we collect a wide range of data on company performance so that we can build an overall picture of a company's readiness to both respond to these challenges and also seize the opportunities. And our themes also map closely to the Sustainable Development Goals, and you can see the 2 that map closest here on the slide. So moving on to the next slide, please. As owners of companies and providers of capital, investors have significant influence, and a key mechanism for doing this is through our stewardship and engagement. Now, health and nutrition has been a focus for us for a number of years, and I wanted to bring to life some of those examples. Firstly, we have supported the development of the Access to Nutrition Index since 2014, which focuses on developing tools and data that track and drive the contribution made by the food and beverage sector to addressing the world's global nutrition challenges. Some of you may also remember our Investor Day back in 2017, which focused on the risks of sugar and what was seen then as the emerging public health crisis around obesity rates. Not too much has changed there. We also co-developed the investor expectations on sugar, obesity, and non-communicable diseases in the same year, outlining the 5 core principles for companies to follow. And more recently, we've been working with the Food Foundation and their Plating Up Progress initiative, which has been focused on standardizing nutrition and environmental disclosures from companies in the food sector. We've also been an active member and an advisor to Share Action's Healthy Markets initiative, which is particularly focused on tackling childhood obesity in the UK. And the initiative supports collective investor engagement with companies. And it led the recent nutrition-related shareholder resolutions at Tesco and Unilever, which were successful in pushing for more ambitious health and nutrition strategies. In the case of Tesco, this was the first ever health-based resolution. And this year alone, we've seen several more take place at the likes of Coca-Cola, Kellogg, Nestle, and others. We've also engaged with policymakers, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But as you can see from these examples, we use a really wide range of tools and levers in our engagement work, from individual company dialogue to collaborating with partners to engaging at the policy level. With a common thread through all this activity is to create real world and long-term positive change. Next slide, please. So briefly, what has some of this investor stewardship work contributed to? Well, first, we've seen incremental improvements in disclosure and encouraging signs that some companies are moving in the right direction, led by retailers. 60% of the UK grocery market has now made commitments to increase healthier sales across at least some of their products. And an increase, that is an increase of 15% since Share Action's Healthy Markets engagement programme began its focused dialogue with retailers. We've also seen growing investor awareness of health and nutrition as a material issue. So health has traditionally not been well understood or prioritised as a stewardship theme by investors, but this is really fast changing. Between just 2019 and 2022 alone, the signatory base of the Access to Nutrition initiative grew significantly, from it representing $7 trillion in assets under management to now representing over 19.2. And as I already mentioned, there's been several nutrition-related shareholder resolutions. And these are a sign that mainstream investors are now waking up to the direct and systemic risks that nutrition, and in particular obesity, poses to the companies that they hold across multiple sectors. But there is still much further to go. A key issue for investors is comparability, as there is a notable lack of consistency or standardization in how information on this issue is being reported. And we've also heard that earlier from Judith. We ultimately end up comparing apples to oranges. Mandatory reporting, one of the recommendations Judith outlined earlier of key metrics, would really ensure that we had a level playing field for companies, and it would allow investors to accurately understand what progress is being made and enable us to allocate capital to those companies that are supporting the transition to a sustainable and healthy food system. And that brings me on to the policy engagement work that we've been doing to try and address this. On to the next slide, please. So when the National Food Strategy came out, which we've already heard about a lot today, we were excited to see that one of the key recommendations was that mandatory reporting requirements should be introduced for large companies in the food sector to report on their products, sales, and food waste, and that voluntary reporting wouldn't be enough. We wanted to rally investor support in this measure, and so the Investor Coalition on UK Food Policy, as we are called today, was born. This started with us organising an investor briefing with the National Food Strategy team last summer ahead of its publication. Given the investor interest in this briefing, we then put together an investor letter outlining our support for the mandatory reporting recommendation and what we saw as some of the key risks facing the food sector, and how these could be addressed by well-designed regulation. This was sent to the Prime Minister alongside the Secretaries of State for DEFRA and the Department for Health and Social Care. We grew the signatory base over time and now have 23 signatories representing over 6 trillion in assets under management or under advice. Next slide, please. And I'm pleased to say we did get a response. And the letter on this slide was from Minister Victoria Prentice within DEFRA for responsibility for the National Food Strategy. And as you can see from this quote, which will hopefully appear now, she was open to working with investors. This then led to follow-on meetings with DEFRA and the Department for Health and Social Care, alongside a core group of investors, including one with Minister Prentice, where we shared the investor case for mandatory reporting. A key belief underpinning our engagement strategy at Greenbank is that collaboration creates faster and greater impact. And this was definitely true with this engagement. We've worked really closely with a core group of investors, as well as with the Food Foundation and Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation. And as a coalition, we were pleased to see this measure stay in the government's response to the food strategy, which Henry also picked up on earlier. And we're also proud that we've gone from a place where investors were not on the government's radar as a stakeholder group to now having a seat at the table as we decide what data should be reported, including being part of the multi-stakeholder Food Data Transparency Partnership, which the government announced this week. Overall, though, we were disappointed to see how few of the recommendations were included in the government's response, especially around health, and hope to see some of these picked up in the Department for Health and Social Care's upcoming Health and Disparities paper. So we're definitely proud of what we've achieved to date, but the hard work definitely starts here, and we will continue to play a leadership role with this engagement and push for government to be bold and ambitious in the coming months. And with that, I will hand back to Rosie and look forward to the question session that we have next.
Sophie, thank you so much. That was really tremendous. I mean, it's obviously in a lot of the work that estimates happening behind all of it, and how much you can lead things behind the scenes and indeed in front of the scenes now too. So we've got lots of questions coming in and not a massive amount of time, but I suppose I want to kick off with one of my own to all three of you, which is to talk about the current situation in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis. And you do see, or at least I feel, there is a massive tension here between, do we go all out to just grow crops that will make cheap food more available to people, or at least that's the belief, or do we kind of hold firm towards more sustainable farming and healthy farming? So Corinna, can I start with you on that and where you might see this, as I say, tension dilemma playing out in terms of everybody's bills in the coming months?
Yes, we've got caught in a vicious cycle that relies on cheap food. So if we then say, well, we need to integrate health and sustainability and internalize the true costs of food, that food will then become more expensive. That seems to be counter to the desperate reality that millions of people now face of not being able to afford food. It's a moral tension, and it's a very difficult tension. And it's a tension that has to be resolved through redesigning the way the system works, because it's simply unsustainable to be so enthralled to low food prices that when they go up, when there is a disruption of the system, and there will be more disruptions of the system as we see climate change along with conflict and economic disruptions continue in the next few years, that's inevitable. We will continue to see food prices rise, we'll continue to see energy prices high. So the reality is that food prices are going to continue to go up. So now is the time to say, right, how do we actually create a food system? How do we actually support our populations to create a food system which is built on different principles? But that takes leadership and courage to make those kinds of decisions, because there are important political implications to higher food prices. So in other words, we need to provide strong social safety nets to make sure that our most vulnerable populations are able to manage through this very difficult period.
Yeah, thank you. That was such a good answer and encompasses everything. I mean, as you say, it's about leadership and courage. Judith, when you look at your massive industry experience, how do you think industry should respond to all the inevitable price rises that they're facing through the complicated food chains of the world?
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. I think there are a couple of things on that, actually. I think the first thing is, and we saw this during the coronavirus, it is possible for the way that a retailer would manage their pricing and promotions budgets to target those budgets towards those people who need them most. So I'll give you a good example. With Healthy Start vouchers, one of the things that was done by a number of retailers, my old retailer included, was where a customer will present with a Healthy Start voucher, you can complement that Healthy Start voucher with something else that's good. So for example, I think some retailers gave away products. So some retailers like Sainsbury's gave away a £2 voucher for fruit and veg for every Healthy Start voucher. So there are ways to do that. There are ways to do that for people who have got loyalty cards, because you can create specific prices for specific loyalty card holders. Similarly, when in the coronavirus, government had to give gift cards for free school meals, again, you could target those customers that had the free school meal gift card and supplement that. So there are ways of using data and systems to over-invest in those customers that need it most. And of course, the other way that's done is through food banks and food donations. But of course, that takes people out of the mainstream food system, and we know that there's certain stigmas associated with that. So keeping people within the food system is a good thing. So I suppose that's one, the data and targeting it is in one way. And then what I would call the under the bonnet stuff that goes on in the background. There is a good understanding of supply chains. And I talked earlier about the fact that you've got this highly fragmented, highly consolidated, odd food system. Those highly consolidated points are the points of interest, because that's where big things can happen. And whether that's around human rights, whether that's around health and nutrition, whether that's around climate or biodiversity. The key thing is knowing what's material and where in those supply chains to build around those points of interest a more resilient food system and a food system that pays the true price for those externalities, because you can't do everything. You've got to prioritise. But we do know where those points of interest are, and therefore collectively, and because they are consolidation points, all roads lead to them. So, you know, it is a lot easier to focus on that when a lot of people can focus on a few things to drive change. So those would be my kind of two approaches.
That's great. That's really interesting. And Sophie, how, from an investor point of view, I mean, is it a naive question to ask, you know, as the price of wheat soars, are investors more likely to trade it to try and, you know, make more money out of it?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one, isn't it? And there's definitely no easy answer. And Judith and Corinna have already kind of picked up on this. I think one interesting thing that is happening, and that is maybe a silver lining, and I hate to say that because we're talking at the end of the day about real hardship and huge rising food insecurity. So, you know, I say that with that in mind, but I do think that this is focusing people's attention on this issue more than ever before. And I think that we've seen the kind of the current situation build on what was already happening with the pandemic impacting, you know, the economy so greatly, and that being front of people's minds. And I think, you know, if we just think back to some of the things I've talked about around the kind of mainstream investors starting to see this as a systemic risk and a direct risk to some of the companies in their portfolio, I think that that's only going to continue. And I think, you know, increased investor pressure, increased civil society pressure, we've got to kind of do something. I think what we do, you know, and I think Judith and Corinna have outlined a brilliant vision today, is not easy, but we have to, as far as possible, kind of think long term, and we've got to get this right. Essentially, we can't afford to lose. And I think investors, you know, as I've kind of outlined today, do have a big role to play with that. And they haven't necessarily been there to date, but I think we can really build on the sort of foundations that we've built on this, and really continue to put pressure on companies.
Fantastic. That's a great answer. And I know we're nearly up to time, but I'd like Corinna and Judith to answer them, and you have to answer quite quickly. Isabella Van Dam asks, from a climate perspective, we're encouraged to eat more plant-based food. However, many of the plant-based products sold as alternative to animal-derived products are highly processed. Is there therefore a tension between health and climate aims when thinking about sustainable food systems? I thought that was a very interesting question. And can I get a quick answer from Corinna? I'll start with you and then Judith.
Well, the easiest thing to say is that we shouldn't have the ultra-processed, we shouldn't have the highly processed, and we should be having beans, legumes, fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, because that's ideally what we would be eating. But this is a journey. It's a journey. Okay. And we have to be taking steps towards it in the right direction. Yeah, that's a really good answer. And Judith, I mean, I have to say I have looked at some of that, you know, vegan cheese, for instance, and it's a list as long as your arm of stuff that's in it.
No, I agree with Corinna. I think the other point that I would make is, and I say this because I'm a trustee at Kew Gardens, so you'd expect me to, but there's a whole world of plants and fungi out there with unbelievable nutrition qualities that we haven't even yet begun to think about how we could responsibly commercialize some of those crops, and whether that's climate resilient and drought resilient coffees and teas and cocoas for the things that we all love, or whether it's more unusual beans, pulses, legumes that have got really massive protein and other nutritional qualities. So there is a bit about how do we diversify the crops that we produce, because we eat from a very narrow range of commercial crops. But the things that, you know, Corinna says is we're on a journey from loving our ultra processed foods to eating something that's more like something your granny would recognize as a food. So, but we've got to start somewhere.
No, that's a very good answer. And I think, you know, we're all on a journey, and hopefully we're just putting our foot on the gas. And no, that's a really bad thing, believe me. We're just accelerating at this moment. So thank you all from me very much. And I'm going to thank everybody, but from me, thank you all very much. I've learnt a lot, and I hope that my technical issues weren't too challenging. John.
Thank you, Rosie. So really all it remains for me to say is a big thank you to all of our speakers, Corinna, Judith and Sophie, our chair, Rosie, as well as to our organisers today, and importantly to all of you for listening and engaging so actively with the debate. Sustainability is really a spider's web of interactions and intersects, and today's event provides just one example, highlighting the many links between healthy eating, food production, poverty, business, investment, the environment, and critically, that including climate change. Our speakers have clearly articulated the challenges we face, but more importantly, some of the solutions. This is an issue clearly requiring systemic change, improving the production and processing of food, developing data standards and reporting, improving education, and even making changes to the social and physical fabric of the world in which we live. At Greenbank, we will continue to play our role as investors and as stewards of our clients' capital to help bring about this change through the research we conduct and the investment decisions we make, through how we vote at client shareholder meetings, through how we engage with investee companies to encourage the continued improvement of business practice, and through the leadership and membership of investor forums lobbying for change. The recording of today's Investor Day will be available to view on demand by using the same link that you have used today. Please do share this with anyone you think might be interested. We will also write up the event in our Investor Day review, and this will be available on our website and in soft and hard copy formats a little later in the year. We would also be hugely grateful if you could take a couple of minutes to fill out the feedback form via the link on the engagement panel. This really does help us understand where we can improve for the future. So on that note, do get in touch if you have any further questions on this subject, Greenbank services, or anything else that you would like to talk to Greenbank about. Thank you all once again. Go out and enjoy sunshine.